So we're going to go into one of the most difficult periods today for students of AP history and really American history in general, and that's the Gilded Age. You may recall, of course, the phrase Gilded Age. It's used by Mark Twain to describe something that on the surface is kind of shiny, but in reality it's kind of rotten. And this is the framework as presented. It's period 6. I've chose to bring out the parts of the framework that are specifically dealing with Gilded Age politics, particularly the debate about what it means to be a citizen in our society, the role of like corruption and government. And then we're going to look at political decisions and judicial decisions, in this case, affecting Jim Crow and the nature of the relationship of African Americans post-Civil War, after Reconstruction. And then another debate, political debate, that would occur over the role of new immigrants, particularly immigrants from places like Eastern Europe and Asia, and how the guide here talks about both assimilation and a term that I don't really use, but that's interesting, called Americanization, and the compromises that had to be made in the country. And then particularly focused today on the belief, economic belief of the politicians of this period, overwhelmingly fairly consistent. And then I'm not going to do much today on the Populist Party. That's a lesson in and of itself of great discontent. But the big topic today are going to be what divided the two major political parties in the United States after the Civil War. What particular issues were controversial or served as a dispute, particularly since the issue of slavery is now no longer a major dividing issue. It's been resolved. And then lastly, we're going to also look at the role of re-emergent, they'd already existed, but continually more powerful political machines and what their roles were in particularly urban environment. Okay, so one of the things about the word Gilded Age, the phrase, is that the Civil War was a war of idealism in some respect. If you think about what we recall from World War I, it was a war to end all wars, according to Wilson. Lincoln had promised in his second inaugural and in his Gettysburg Address that this war was not simply a war to keep the states unified, but rather to create a new birth of freedom and a guarantee of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. These are very lofty goals. He couched the language of the Civil War in the language of the American Revolution, and so what we thought we were getting as a nation was sort of a new birth of freedom, and instead we got a birth of one of the most politically corrupt periods in the history of our country. And people became disillusioned with that. And also, you're going to see a real decline in the 20th century in political participation. And I see this sort of similar context in the wake of World War II. We were very nationalistic, very pro-democracy, pro our country and our government. And in the wake of particularly the Vietnam War, we became disillusioned again. And so there is a sort of sequential pattern America has followed of sort of high goals and lofty ambition that often are more than what the American governmental system or political system are able to deliver. And this is really embodied in a lot of ways in the figure of Ulysses Grant. Grant was, by all accounts, an American hero. He had helped devise the strategy effectively to really end the Civil War. He understood that it was a total war that would require attrition, and that was something that the previous generals had not wanted to do. He was seen as the great hero of the war. He was not particularly politically active at all, but once he emerged as a national hero, the Republican Party particularly saw him as an opportunity to seize the government, particularly in the wake of Andrew Johnson, who was seen as really a Democrat in a Republican office. So Grant, again, was a decent fella. He was clearly a country man in the sense of earthy and really sort of one of the ordinary Americans who had done extraordinary achievement. But he was completely unfamiliar with the highly sophisticated nature of the Washington political apparatus. If you want to consider something like with today President Trump making the statement of draining the swamp. The swamp has come to describe, in essence, the political system within Washington, D.C. Well, in many ways, the American political system also was a swamp in 1868. The difference was Grant didn't verbalize it that way, and certainly didn't set out to reform the American political system. He saw himself as a leader, and he had received gifts from public people, and thought that he was, you know, the sort of savior, one of the deliverers of America, and he liked that role. And unfortunately, it meant he at times, not always he personally, but at times, he didn't see the corruption within his own government until often it was too late, and this would lead to some really disastrous results. So, in many ways, while Grant himself was not a corrupt figure, and I wouldn't want you to think that Grant was not a immoral, indecent person, but he was a poor judge of character, and that meant he often either appointed, because of the Republican Party machine, or selected individuals who he had personal relationships with that were not so upright, not so virtuous. And so what this leads to is his presidency, like the presidency of Warren Harding, as associated as one of the most corrupt presidents in history. And again, that's not really fair to him, but his administration certainly, about Harry Truman, the buck stops with him, is going to be associated with corruption. Now, in '68, he is selected as the candidate. It is not a foregone conclusion that General Grant will be elected. You may recall that in '64, the Democrats had run a serious campaign with General McClellan against President Lincoln, and had done fairly well considering Lincoln's successes. So this is the issue that would become interesting for the Democrats, is what would become their sort of guiding policy. Now, if you go back to Grant really runs on support of the 14th Amendment, support of Reconstruction, the fact that the Democrats were the party of the Confederacy. Now, I would emphasize that Grant himself does not run. He doesn't go out and give speeches. He is a front porch candidate, we sometimes call him. And that means that it would be Republican Party operatives. This was a party campaign. And the same would be true of the Democratic campaign until near the very end of the campaign in '68, when Seymour does go out for a little while and give some pretty boring speeches. But the Democrats had a very hard time nominating a candidate. It's pretty clear that they're going to have to nominate a Northerner, since many of the Southern Democratic leadership had been disenfranchised as a result of the 14th Amendment. And so ultimately, as a compromise candidate, not really a dark horse, he was the chairman of the Democratic Party convention. He didn't want to be nominated, but he was sort of the compromise candidate that was ultimately arrived at in the form of Governor Horatio Seymour. Now, the Democrats ran a platform, Vice President candidate Francis Blair and others, of opposing civil rights for African Americans. They opposed Reconstruction, particularly military Reconstruction. But the fundamental issue that ultimately emerged out of the Democratic Party was it was really two parties, two different groups. And one were the future populists, the idea of the free silver advocates, and the idea of inflation. And this was first proposed really right after the Civil War in, of all places, Cincinnati, Ohio. So kind of out of nowhere comes this idea of, we need to pay off the debt of the United States in paper money. The reason, of course, for this is not very much gold in circulation, which meant money was somewhat scarce. And so when Senator Pendleton, and this is Pendleton of the future Pendleton Civil Service Act, a very famous Ohioan, when he proposes this, it becomes a key idea that Democrats want to run. It's called the Ohio idea. And that is to keep money that's paper money in circulation, in essence, inflationary policies. Unfortunately, the candidate, Governor Seymour, unfortunate for the Democrats at least, he doesn't support this. He rejects the idea. So here you see an issue that's going to be consistently the problem with the Democrats for the next 30 years, and that is some of the key Democrat constituents, particularly Westerners, frontier types, are supporting inflation, and the more conservative gold bugs, as they're later called, are opposed to inflation, even later like Grover Cleveland. So this will be the thing that divides the Democratic Party ultimately throughout this period. And of course, the other major issue is that the Democrats are going to be associated with the Confederacy. This is a very sort of ugly cartoon here depicting, if you're familiar with Harper's Weekly, this was the Thomas Nast platform. He was very critical of New York Democrats himself, particularly the role of the Irish. You can see here the Irish, who were a core Democrat voting group. Here you see, if you take a look back at the picture here, Governor Seymour and his monetary policy. And then this is a Confederate, you know, and all three of these individuals, Eastern bankers, Irishmen, and Confederates, are standing astride the word was colored, or a freedman, an African American who was a veteran. You can tell here the flag, and he's trying to reach to the ballot. What a brilliant cartoon! It's certainly the kind of cartoon that might appear on a DBQ or an LQ. And then so here it's the Democratic Party holding back the freedmen from voting, particularly the argument goes in the South. Another key argument is this waving the bloody shirt, reminding voters that if you vote for the Democratic Party, even though Francis Blair was a Union veteran, you can see him here, General Blair, and Governor Seymour was the governor of New York, they are going to be tarred with the idea of that the Confederacy and the Civil War was a product of the Democratic Party. And so here you see the change from the Confederate banner to the KKK and candidate Seymour Blair. We might call this a 19th century Southern strategy by the Republican Party. So the election is held, and you may notice that Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia do not vote. The reason is they have not ratified the 14th Amendment. They have not passed the rules for military reconstruction. That is going on during this period. So never forget that Reconstruction and the Gilded Age overlap. But if you see here, Grant does very well, remarkably, in places like Tennessee, North Carolina, Alabama, and Florida. But the reason is, and don't forget this, in fact, it is the reason why Grant wins the popular vote, probably why in many ways he wins the election, is because almost 450,000 free black people will vote, men will vote in these states. So during the 1860s, before the end of Reconstruction, African Americans are a key voting group for the Republican Party. And many ex-Confederates are not eligible to vote. And so that means you see Republicans actually winning Confederate states. Now, as soon as Reconstruction ends, this will not be the case anymore. But it is a fairly close election. If you look over here, I told you over 400,000 African Americans voted for Grant. If they don't vote for Grant, then Governor Seymour wins the popular vote. It's not a sure thing that he would have won the electoral vote, but it is probable he would have done much better, obviously. So this is not a unified election for Ulysses Grant and for the American public. So when he comes into office, he is almost immediately, he takes office in 1869, and immediately he starts to have problems associated with people around his administration. Now, I don't want to get too complicated here in what becomes known as the Erie or Gold Ring, but it involved two unscrupulous, sort of crooked individuals who were involved in business. They were part of the railroad industry, and they tried to rig the gold market, and in essence, cheat the public by buying as much gold at its ordinary price, and then creating an artificial panic where people would rush out to buy gold because there wasn't so much of it. And they were doing this with the certitude that the Grant administration would withhold gold from the public. Of course, the United States government was the largest gold holder in America. But Grant, without informing the public gradually how this was going to do, released large amounts of gold, and so the inflated price that Fisk and Gould had generated immediately plummeted, and lots of people who had bought gold at a very inflated price now saw their entire savings evaporate. And so this wasn't Grant's fault in a sense that he didn't do this, but his reaction to it spiked or triggered a market meltdown here. So I would definitely be familiar with this, one of the first of many scandalous events in the Grant era. Now, this one is often lumped in with U.S. Grant, and that is really unfortunate because, first of all, the Tammany Hall precedes the Civil War. I mean, that predates the Civil War. So Tammany Hall was in no ways a result directly of U.S. Grant. And secondly, Tammany Hall, as it was called, named for Chief Tammany here in Manhattan, was a Democratic Party operation. It was run by a political boss. He's depicted here by Thomas Nast. This is Boss Tweed, William Marcy Tweed. Here he's depicted again, the voter intimidation, vultures picking over the bones of the American polity. And so he ran this corrupt machine very, very effectively for the better part of 20 years. He is going to fleece the public of New York City out of millions of dollars. And ultimately, it is this cartoonist who brings to the public attention the role of this crooked scheme of basically using bribes and kickbacks to pay for operatives to have jobs and to create money in terms of government contracts that they will then use to give back to the political machine. And here you see a host of Democratic operatives, be they ordinary working class Irishmen, political operatives, Boss Tweed himself, or companies that are getting these bribes and kickbacks. And so it takes several years of Nast running cartoons like this in Harper's Weekly and the New York papers. He is targeted for death threats. There is a bounty on his head at one point. But, in the end, Nast is going to prevail and help raise public awareness. And Nast is really one of those interesting characters in American history. As far as visual artist, is Thomas Nast, who creates this. This is the sort of legacy of the zoo, the political zoo, as it's sometimes called here. And here you see he is the figure who created the Republican elephant, the Grand Old Party symbol, a sign of strength and sort of diligence and getting the job done. And he uses, interestingly enough, a jackass, a donkey, to represent the Democratic Party, obviously not very complimentary. And so here, you see the Democrats being modeled as a fake lion of Caesar. And will the Southern, pit draw the Republicans into it? And here, he's sort of critical of the party for risking the security by taking on these issues. But nonetheless, he's a zealot Republican and very, very critical of the Democrats. Now, Nast also gets the sort of claim to fame of giving us the image of who we think jolly old Saint Nick is, rather than some sort of European druid. Now he becomes, the stomach that shook like a bowl full of jelly here. And just the guy we think of as Santa Claus is really one of Nast's great contributions. So in the end, Nast brings public awareness, and then this individual, Sam Tilden, who is the prosecuting attorney in New York, is going to go after Tweed, and Tweed will flee the country. He'll ultimately be recognized in Europe, and he'll end up in prison. So, think of that next time you think about how corruption often works out. Tilden was considered an honest, decent man. He will later be run as a candidate for president. In fact, he very well could have been President Tilden in 1876, but nonetheless, he'll emerge as a key reformer against the corruption of the political machine. And as Tweed says, my constituents don't read, but it's those damn pictures that are going to ultimately bring them down. Now, here you see again Grant, who, he's a Republican, but he's an easy target for cartoonists because, during this period, every time you turn your head, there was another corrupt event, another period where the government was ripping off the public, or government officials were ripping off the public, or using their office for personal gain and the abuse of others. So we're going to look at a couple individual key scandals, and then there are a host of others. To give you a sense, PowerPoint I put online, it has, these are all scandals during the Grant presidency. Now, not all of them, again, are directly related to his policies, but nonetheless, his presidency is overwhelmingly associated with scandal. And so I would like you to know three specific scandals that are somewhat directly related to Grant's presidency. The first involves a railroad company, the railroad company called Crédit Mobilier, an odd-sounding name, French-sounding name. Crédit Mobilier was part of this transcontinental railroad construction boom, and they were giving shares of stock to particularly Republican, but congressmen in general. They were giving them stocks in exchange for getting bids from the government to build parts of the railroad. Now, the problem, of course, was this company wasn't producing much of anything. They were just giving money to politicians and padding their own pockets with this. It ultimately became publicized. You can see here, Crédit Mobilier. Here's Boss Conkling. And so this was an example of railroads involving in corruption with the government. The next was The whiskey ring, there was an excise tax on whiskey. You know, I don't know exactly when they had brought that back from the Hamilton era, but of course it's easy to tax alcohol, so a fairly easy excise tax to put on. And the secretary who was running this, keeping up with this, basically just pocketed the money personally. You know, this is overt example of people just stealing money directly from the treasury. You can see here corrupt officials and whiskey makers stealing millions as direct embezzlement. And then lastly, that I would definitely want you to know is the Belknap or Indian ring scandal. And this is really gives you a sense of context. So if you think about it for a minute, Crédit Mobilier will allow you to remember that this is during the 1860s and 70s when the railroads were being constructed, particularly the transcontinental railroad. Now, the Indian ring would also trigger something, I hope, help you remember something, I hope, and that is the War Department was supposed to provide things like blankets and, you know, supplies to the Native Americans who had signed treaties that they would be taken care of and left alone, i.e., you know, no more loss of land in the Great Plains. Well, here's the Secretary of War taking money and instead not providing very good supplies to the Native Americans. So that gives us a reminder that this is during the Plains Indians discussion. So we've got connection to railroads post-Civil War, connection to Native Americans post-Civil War, and then, like I said, there's just a host of others. These are two or three that would give you good support. So in the midst of this, and a lot of these scandals do emerge before the election. You can see here, the elections, of course, in the fall, and these become familiar. Now, a lot of these scandals don't become noted until Grant's second term, as you can see. But already by his re-election campaign, that's starting to be an issue. And so an individual who had been a reformer dating back to the pre-Civil War period, who was also a newspaper publisher, was named Horace Greeley. And Greeley had been an overt critic of the Confederacy, a huge public voice against a war for slavery, as he saw it. And he was going to run as a reformer against Grant. But the problem was he's running as a Democrat. Keep that in mind. Here's the nominee in Baltimore. And if he runs as a liberal Republican, he's a breakaway or insurgent candidate against Grant's Republican Party, as he saw it. And then the Democrat Party nominates him, and he accepts the nomination. Now, he considers this sort of ends justifying the means, but in reality, Horace Greeley is now siding with ex-Confederates. It's how it's perceived. And Greeley, I think figured this was, again, worth the effort. Greeley would be depicted as sort of a bizarre individual. He was considered erratic, behaved, maybe even mentally not well. And just absolutely hammered in the media of that era, particularly cartoonists. And it's very, I think, good that Greeley probably didn't get elected because he actually died a couple weeks after the election. And so if he'd been elected, that would have been a really bizarre situation where the individual who was voted for died before they took office. But nonetheless, he died. Some argue that he died as a result of his failed candidacy. But regardless, it shows you that the Democrats are trying to find a path to electability, even if it means nominating an infamous anti-Democrat. But Grant is reelected. You can see here, he does, again, very well in the South. Now, these are fully reconstructed states now, as you can see, and they split between Democrat nominees. But Grant, does very comfortably against someone like Greeley. And again, the majority of the scandals of his administration haven't been discovered yet. So here, again, I really want to emphasize that Grant is going to do well in the regions of the South, which, if you go back to the pre-Civil War discussion, this is the Cotton Kingdom, or sometimes called the Black Belt. So these light blue, like Republicans voting here, are really individuals who are part of Reconstruction and African Americans. And as soon as Reconstruction ends, Republicans are basically going to just sacrifice these districts completely. They're going to, because of course the Redeemer governments are going to make it impossible for African Americans to vote in this part of the country. Okay, so Grant's second term is going to be utterly dominated by an economic crisis. That crisis is called the Panic of 1873. So pretty much as soon as his presidency, his re-election occurs, an enormous panic descends on the United States. And really, this is a depression. To call this a panic would be an accurate description. This depression is due to a variety of things. It had begun, elements of it, with an event known as the Great Chicago Fire. This had really created a ripple. Then you had European banks starting to struggle. And then perhaps most notably in America was the failure of an enormously important bank, J. Cook and Company, an investment bank, who had financed the Northern Pacific Railroad. Now, later on, J.P. Morgan is going to get involved in this. But during the 70s, J. Cook and Company were actually a larger banking syndicate than Morgan. And these were the folks that had financed the Civil War, that had run the bonds for the federal government. Well, the problem was during the 1870s, you had lots of speculation, lots of people buying up land, investing in railroads, and it created a bubble. Then in 1872, they actually had a interesting sort of healthcare crisis. They had a equine flu, which is a type of flu that wiped out a lot of horses. Well, just about everything in the country at that time that was using materials was still horse-drawn. A lot of it was, certainly, and that also sent a ripple through the economy. So all of these things came crashing to a halt in the panic of 1873. And Grant's last action before the panic was something that many people allege was the reason for the panic, and that is something called the Coinage Act of 1873. Coinage Act ended the circulation of silver-backed coins. In other words, it made it a law in the United States that coins would only be backed by gold currency, and that was primarily because of the absence of enough silver to make it worth that bimetallic rate. So this is the moment in which, really the discussion back in 1867 with the Ohio idea becomes full force, because Western farmers are going to say, oh, it was the taking us off of the bimetallic gold and silver standard that caused the Panic of 1873. Now, I'm trying to show you that that's not necessarily the case. The Panic of 1873 was caused by a lot of things, a lot of large-scale forces that were beyond simply a single act. But if you recall the specie circular that Andrew Jackson had done, in many ways, Grant's policies, even though he's a Republican and Jackson was a Democrat, his hard money policies are going to make the Depression worse. And at least that's the position that Western Democrats and folks that were indebted, like landowners, like farmers, are really going to argue. And so Grant does a couple things here. Hit the Republican Party, not just Grant. They're a hard money policy party at that moment. And they de-coin, take away out of coinage, silver-backed currency. And then they make a statement that paper money, now greenbacks, paper money, had been created during the Civil War. The National Currency Act had created inflated currency, in a sense, during the Civil War. And now the Civil War was over, and the Republicans were adopting much harder currency standards, and they were saying that all paper money will only be redeemed in gold. And that meant all of a sudden, and there would be no more paper money issued, which meant now paper money was going to be scarcer. And so debtors were really alarmed by this, because the amount of money in circulation literally shrunk. And it's that shrinking of the economy that is really going to cause this to become a true Great Depression. So lots of factors. And it's very interesting to me to note that this was called in America the Great Depression until the one event in the 1930s that we know to be the Great Depression. So the British called it the Long Depression. Individuals that emerged from this would call it that. It lasted over half a decade, 6 years. During it, you had panics, runs on banks. Here you see they're running on a bank. You had the Tompkins Square riot in 1874. You're going to have the Great Railroad Strike. So this was really an economic collapse period, the mid to late 70s. And Grant, is not going to be actively seeking to find a way to resolve this, because the Republican Party were the hard money party, and also the party of laissez-faire. Well, it turns out so were the Democrats. So when it comes to who's going to intervene on the behalf of Americans, well, neither party is going to make that action. And that's going to disillusion a lot of Americans about the efficacy of our political system. So what then made politics during this period so active if the candidates weren't very good and the people weren't very effective, why did so many people vote? And that has to do with both geography. Clearly, once the Reconstruction ends, now keep in mind that's with the election of 1876, overwhelmingly the former Confederate states and border states are going to vote Democrat for the next almost 100 years. So we're talking this will become, as soon as Reconstruction ends, the solid South. It will stay Democratic Party dominant really until the election of Ronald Reagan as late as 1980. So you're talking about 100 years of Democratic Party allegiance. And of course, a lot of this is due to the role of what the Democratic Party historically stood for in terms of civil rights, in terms of less government interference. And so that's going to consistently be the case. Meanwhile, north of the Mason-Dixon line, with the exception of New York City. Now, keep in mind, New York City is that sort of variable that you always have to consider during this period, because New York was overwhelmingly Democrat, overwhelmingly immigrant. But the rest of the state was rural and much more Republican. And so you're going to see, by and large, the northern states almost always voting Republican. And you may remember, this is where the bulk of the American population was, other than African Americans who were disenfranchised during this period. There are lots of Republican northern states like that. So it's like, did we really see an end to America's political division? And so this balance meant that every election was going to be close. Every election was going to be fierce, particularly national elections. And because of that, you see tremendous voter turnout, like comparable to the age of Jackson, where voters eligible for, and keep in mind, many of these states are now African American voters. In some of these states, particularly in the West, you even have the first women voters. So 80% voter turnout. That is a astonishing number. And you can almost directly associate the decline with the passage of something called the Pendleton Civil Service Act. The reason for this, if you want to come up with a direct response, is the spoil system. You voted because your party boss, or because your boss, your employer, was going to determine your economic survival based on how you voted, and you were going to get something for it, or you were going to lose something as a result of it. So voting was very personal. It was very, what is in it for me? It's very selfish, self-absorbed, self-focused. And as soon as you see civil service reform, where now you're voting for ideas and for theoretical party policies, you see a lot of decline, because you're like, I'm not getting anything out of this. What's in it for me? So that was a key thing. And another element of this party system is who the people were that made up the party. And they were a very diverse group. If you look at this group, you would not usually associate Southern whites with Catholics and Jews all in the same group, as well as urban factory workers and agrarian farmers. What a powerful voting bloc. And as soon as Reconstruction ends, you're going to start to see the Democratic Party begin to rise, so to speak, and sort of see more people elected. Think of Cleveland's 2 elections, later Woodrow Wilson, FDR, and on up to the Reagan era. So the Republicans are traditional. So if you do sort of back in history context, the Democrats had almost always been white Southerners, Jefferson and Jackson's era. But the Catholic immigrant working poor was also an element of the Democrats, because they had, if you go back to immigrants in the Alien and Sedition Act, they had voted Democrat. And Jefferson represented the rural farmers until Lincoln brought the Free Soilers into Republicans. So you got historic Whigs, historic Federalists in this group. Okay, they're still there predominantly. African Americans, this is where you see a major switch in the 20th century, but throughout most of the late 19th century, when blacks vote, they vote Republican. The waspish Northerners, this would be, we often think of this as like the middle class of New England, and think of all of the New England region, really, and the WASPs in general, who were anti-immigrant. So you may recall Republicans that had a nativist element to them that Lincoln had pushed down. Well, you see it resurgent, during this period, particularly towards Asians and towards Eastern Europeans. And really, it was the middle class party. So this is a very well-defined group, and it represented almost a balance in who these were as Americans. And so keep in mind, one of the reasons why Wilson ultimately will sort of accept women voting and support the 19th Amendment begrudgingly is he recognizes that if women see the Democrats as the party that supported them, then they'll have a lot better chance at getting routine election victories. So during this entire period, I really want to emphasize this, the role of the federal government declined dramatically. Now, you might say, well, you know, the role of the federal government had increased dramatically during the Civil War, and that's true. You know, Lincoln by far was the most active president we would have, maybe until FDR. But that being said, there was a sort of return to traditional federal government during this period, in a sense that they did not intervene in things like the Panic of 1893 or the Panic of 1873. They viewed this as the role of the government, to keep a national military, although fairly small, to collect taxes and try to keep those relatively low, except for tariff if you're a Republican, and to do the business of foreign policy. So this is what a pre-progressive United States federal government looked like. This is what, without the progressive movement, the role of both Democrats and Republicans. So they were really fighting over the periphery, over issues like race, obviously important, over the issues like veterans, obviously important, but these are sort of non-shared national issues as much as they are, you know, who gets the spoils, so to speak. So much less intervention of the federal government in virtually anything. And that meant the president was not very important. And I really want to emphasize that, because we do call the presidents of the Gilded Age the forgettable presidents for a reason. Not only because they either died or got killed, but, you know, really they just were not luminaries. They were not figures who were trying to be active presidents. And so, you know, if you go back and judge Jefferson as a president, he didn't do a whole lot, but that's kind of what he believed in terms of presidency. And so it was a period when the party bosses of New York City or of the various big cities would dominate the national conventions. They would nominate they would dominate the nominating process. And so really what happened was you'd often see presidents emerge who could find a way to reach the compromise between what we would call factions. So think of the Republican Party in office was really a divided party, just like the Democrats were, over various issues. And really what they were most divided over was who got to hand out the jobs, who got to hand out spoils. So here you see hundreds, tens of thousands, hundred thousands of people now working for the federal government. And that meant, you know, this, if you voted, you did it with the hope that you would get some sort of job or some sort of kickback. And again, this is the sort of zenith or nadir of the, depending on how you look at it, of the spoil system. And that's kind of what the government was basically doing. Now, one of the key characteristics of President Grant's era is he was an active Reconstruction advocate. He had been a sort of persistent defender of the freedmen, and that meant he had gone after things like the Klan in the early 1870s. The Force Bill had been passed, but really, you know, the Panic and Grant's policies involving the former Southern states and the corruption, you know, and the fact that he really sort of his hard money policy alienated a lot of the working class people within the Republican Party. And he initially had defended the Native Americans, you know. So Grant, who I consider to be, like I said, fairly honorable, had become sort of unpopular within some of his own regional support. But 1876 comes along, and Grant really seriously considers running again, you know, for a third term. He considers breaking the tradition here. You can see all the hounds barking at him, you know, all the weight that he's carrying. And so when Grant chooses not to run for a third term, he's still seen as a national hero, a leader to some degree, to a lot of Americans. And he's not unpopular when he leaves office by a host of Americans. And the Republicans are still in a very important position. So that creates a moment where, because of Grant's relative unpopularity within obviously within Southerners, but also within parts of the Republican Party, Democrats felt like they could seize the initiative here, particularly if they run a squeaky clean candidate. This election will be about running decent people. That's the whole point. It's like, let's run the most honest, decent guys we can find in the party. So they ran Rutherford Hayes, who was considered completely honorable. And they ran, the Dems ran Sam Tilden, who had just made a claim to fame of prosecuting false tweet. So you have these two like honorable guys who are going to relatively reform Washington. They're going to drain the swamp. They're going to clean up Washington. You know, I think if people voted in this election, they probably didn't have to hold their nose and say, I can't stand either one of these. These were both decent individuals. And so the election comes down, and it is an issue because it's clear that there are fundamental groups that sort of white Americans, to, I guess, put it bluntly, are not happy about being core constituencies. So in other words, the rest of the Democratic Party is not thrilled about the Irish as a sort of unfortunate balancer. And then, of course, the Republicans are not thrilled that they are depending on black votes. And so you have the Irish versus the black vote in this famous cartoon. And in the end, this is how the election goes. Now, I really want you to look at the map at these three states, because these three states are still under military occupation of military reconstruction. And unfortunately, the government that exists has, in all three states, the military government has sort of divided determination on who wins the election. This is one of the most sort of fraught with uncertainty elections in history. You know, and these three states submit separate returns. You know, like, in other words, the Dems submit returns and the Republicans submit. They both claim victory in all three states. And much of it hinges on, in other words, it seems that probably Hayes is going to, you know, win these two in a close race, but Florida will determine who wins the presidency. You can see here, whoever gets those 4 electoral votes becomes president. And Florida is the hardest to determine. And so you have this bizarre outcome of the election of 1876 where we're not really sure as America who wins. Now, the Dems win their normal places, you know, and New York. But the Republicans are claiming victory in these 3 southern states. So what that leads to is a political crisis. And it looks like if the election does go to the House, which, keep in mind, these electoral returns are debated on who will accept those returns, and Republicans did control the House, then that means the Republican Party would just pick the president. And Dems were yelling, you know, hey, man, if y'all do this, you know, this could mean violence or worse. And we won't accept the presidency. And so they decided to have a commission, an electoral commission, to determine who won, particularly Florida. And unfortunately, no way to do it fairly, it seems. If you do an odd number, it was, if my memory serves, like 8-7. It was one more Republican than Democrat. And they were going to decide for Hayes. But through some back channeling, they agreed that we should not let Hayes just win. We have to compromise with the South. And the Southerners were demanding, they were saying, look, Tilden wins. You're going to have to give up something. And so the Republican Party say, we will compromise and we will end military reconstruction in these remaining states. So in other words, this is the last time the thing that was created in 1865 will be in existence. This is the last time that these 3 states will be supervised by the U.S. Armed Forces. And this is it's actually a popular move in the North. The North is really tired of fighting this struggle, funding military troops to stay in South Carolina or Florida, and fighting for the freedmen. It's not really their issue anymore. So in the end, you have the very famous Compromise of 1877. Now, historians do argue, I think accurately, that Tilden probably should have won. In other words, Tilden should have probably won Florida based on what we know from the evidence. And we should have probably had a President Tilden. But that's not what happened. The commission does select that the electoral returns for Hayes will be the ones counted. Democrats who aren't in on the decision are going to howl, you know, this is complete unfair, this is complete corruption, and they call it the stolen election of 1876. But in the end, Hayes becomes president, and he's going to be shrouded with an allegation of dishonesty ever since. And unfortunately, Hayes really didn't have anything to do with it. He's not Rutherford, as he was called. But this election, like the stolen election quote of 1824, is completely historically perceived as a unethical election. And with that, you know, the last gasp of civil rights is going to come to an end. If you remember about how Jim Crow was working, Jim Crow was spreading throughout the South in states where the military was not located. And the federal government, sort of the last gasp, tried to protect individuals from discrimination. That's what the Civil Rights Act does. In other words, if you're going to use a public facility, a facility that's like a steamship or a train, you are going to be equal in it. You can't be discriminated in jury selection. We have a case here in Chatham, Virginia, where one of the civil rights cases where the federal judge orders Chatham, the judge in Chatham, to allow black jurors to serve on juries, but without any sort of federal intervention. And there's no sort of enthusiasm for either grant. Keep in mind, this is amidst the panic, the long depression, the Great Depression of 73 to 79. And they just don't enforce this. And within 8 years, 5 of the key civil rights elements have been stripped completely in what are called the civil rights cases. These are rulings against the Civil Rights Act. And so you won't see another Civil Rights Act in America until 1964, until Lyndon Johnson. And this is the end of, this is a return to a really horrific experience for African Americans. Now, most Southern blacks have to take up a sort of unfortunate lifestyle of sharecropping. Now, they're farmers, and many of them, their experience as slaves had prepared them for agriculture, obviously, but they couldn't, under the Reconstruction policies, they were not distributed land. You may recall 40 acres and a mule did not happen, or it didn't happen long in the case of some places. And so what happens is they had to, in essence, rent themselves out to landowners in exchange for a place to live. And so they would end up farming the crops for someone else, but everything they got from the farmer or from the local community was paid in credit from the work they did, and they could never pay the credit back. So every year they got deeper and deeper in debt, particularly for these various resources that they had to consume. And you may recall, and certainly it's what we'll talk about another unit, but the company store is a similar kind of thing to what's going to happen in industry, where the employees are going to be beholden entirely to the employers, and so the landowner sold the stuff to the sharecropper, including seeds and clothing and tools, and then you had to pay for it, and the landowner got the bulk of the profit from it. So it's very similar to feudalism, and during this period, you're going to see an enormous number of sharecroppers, ironically or not ironically, coincidentally or not. It's in the Black Belt, like the Cotton Kingdom is exactly where you see the highest rate of sharecropping. And so, for all intents and purposes, they're free individuals, but they're not free to vote. They're not free to hold office. They're not free to serve on juries. They're not free, in essence, to own land because they don't have any money. And so, this is slavery by another name. It's sharecropping. And the case that you absolutely have to know that is going to kind of end all doubt about discrimination. You had those civil rights cases, remember those in the 1880s, but you have something called the Jim Crow Car Act, which was an actual law designed to create whites-only division in New Orleans. So you have sort of like what we would now call de jure segregation by law, where blacks and whites did not share conveyances. And being, a good American citizen, Homer Plessy sues New Orleans and I forget which individual it was in charge of the transportation department, but he sues him saying that this violates his rights as an individual, it violates his civil rights. And the ruling is sort of, at the time, not so astonishing, but when you look back, you're like, oh my gosh. And the ruling in Plessy was that states could create segregation as long as, here's the key phrase, separate but equal facilities existed. So, and this is the true birth of Jim Crow, because now obviously the 1880s were Jim Crow as well, but this is where it becomes entrenched as constitutional. And so if segregation is constitutional, there's not much you can do about it as an African American. And this will be one of the major issues leading into the debate over civil rights in the 1950s in cases like Brown versus Board. Now, there was one justice, this is Justice Harlan, who dissents, and dissent means speaks against. He disagrees with the reasoning, and he says our Constitution is colorblind. It knows neither class or caste, he uses the word earlier. In other words, regardless if there's a superior race or not, and he says the white race deems itself, that it's not quite the same thing as saying the white race is. He says white people consider themselves dominant. And so it is in case of prestige, achievement, education, wealth. In other words, yes, white people have dominated American history. But in the view of the Constitution, no individual is superior. Now, he's one person in the minority. He's the only guy dissenting. But it is this small little nugget that is going to give African-American civil rights activists like Thurgood Marshall and others some hope that if they can challenge Jim Crow in a future Supreme Court, then perhaps these cases will see this ruling overturned. But again, it will be, if you think about Brown versus Board in context, 1954, so you're talking about 58 years later, almost 60 years later, when that is passed, or when that is ruled. So for a good chunk of American history, Jim Crow is the law of the land, certainly in the South. Now, this is going to lead to the rise of one of the most horrific periods in crime in American history, and that is the sort of de facto hate crime of lynching. What this leads to is that people who are charged with anything, either in public or by the mob, would often be strung up in trees. And think about the song "Strange Fruit," about what hangs from southern trees. And this is a railroad trestle. And I always like to show these pictures to folks because there's this thought that lynching was something that was done in private, like in the deep woods by the Klan, and these were public rallies, spectacles of race supremacy, white supremacy on display, and frequently the people doing the lynching were people in authority, simply guilt by accusation. This will lead to the rise of a group that was established by W.E.B. Du Bois and others called the NAACP, and of course the writings of great editor, publisher, and writer Ida B. Wells, and they're going to try to draw attention to the American public of lynching, but they're not going to have much success because this is one of those problems where white Americans are just simply going to look the other way, and ultimately this will become sort of a peripheral issue that's not a concern of most white Americans, and that's absolutely tragic. So as I was saying earlier, during this period, one of the things that kind of keeps race sort of out of the main debate is the issue of the economy. The Panic of '73 starts for several macroeconomic reasons, but during that, wealthy individuals do not want to see their profits reduced. They don't want to see their status, their income to decline, and so you see things like what the railroad companies are going to do is to actually cut the wages, of their employees during these terrible depressions. And these are folks that were already making very little. So to give you a sense of perspective, an ordinary average American income today, easily $80,000 for a decent pay, $50,000, let's say, from lower middle class. So in 10 years, you would have made this money, today. It would take you 40 years to earn that before their wages were cut. So in other words, you could work a lifetime of struggle and really brutal labor and save virtually, a fifth of what Americans can save today. So meanwhile, some of the wealthiest individuals, the guys that own the railroads, were worth tens and hundreds of billions of dollars in today's money. So if you compare, a fireman made $600 on a railroad, and Cornelius Vanderbilt was worth $9 billion. So $600, $9 billion. You get a sense of this was this huge division of income and wealth, this disparity. And so when their wages were cut, and they were cut also for housing purposes primarily, they went on strike, and one of the largest strikes in American history. You can see all across the country where railroads were most heavily condensed. Obviously not so much here, but particularly east of the Mississippi River, everywhere where the major trunk railroads were. So a huge strike. It just crippled American transportation, and it stopped the delivery of the mail, among other things. And so this becomes a sort of routine. Now, you keep in mind, President Hayes will do this. He'll send in troops to stop the workers. Later on, Grover Cleveland, the Democrat, will do it. So you got Republicans and Democrats actively siding against organized labor, like openly choosing to send in military forces. And that's going to be the hallmark of this period of worker unrest and unhappiness, particularly during this depression. And so one of the things that had happened, and this is going to become a very divisive issue, is that during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, particularly in the Central Pacific, you're going to see the importation of labor, and labor that was distinctive because these were people of East Asian ethnicity, particularly of Chinese ancestry. And when they came over, they kind of stuck to themselves. They didn't try to sort of involve themselves in American politics. And initially they were, kind of accepted. But over time, many white Americans considered these the job stealers. These people had come here and stolen the jobs that would have been, particularly amongst the Irish, that would have been profitable for them. And so you start to see the incorporation of both racist perspective as well as economics. And this is not unusual in our country. This is nativism, major nativism, round two. Nativism round one, you may recall, was really targeting the Irish and the Germans. So the second group are going to get the really heaviest form of nativism are the Chinese. And you see pejorative, like insulting language, like coolie, be used to describe these folks. You would see this kind of racial depiction of Asians. You can see them kind of running away with money as they're kind of stealing it from the laundries they run. And so, this perspective that the Asians were, Chinese particularly, were invading our country. And so you're going to have a law passed, primarily pushed by nativists, and signed by President Arthur, called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this is going to go on the books and will be one of the first of a series of laws leading up to the 1920s that almost eliminates immigration entirely to the United States. So think of this as ushering in a 40-year period of anti-immigration to kind of respond to both Chinese and Eastern European immigrants. And again, being now Wong Kim Ark was not an American yet, but was on the path to citizenship. I think he might have become a citizen at this point. I can't remember if he was born a citizen or not. But he was, by the time of this case, a U.S. citizen. And he sued, again, like a good American, he sues that says that this was a discriminatory law, this act that forbade people to be here from another country, and also set up basically persecution of Chinese Americans. And so what you have here is a very famous case, U.S. v. Wong Kim Ark. And in it, he argues what exactly it means to have rights as an American. Like, as an American, an ethnicity, is it your citizenship dependent on your ethnic background, or do you get the rights of U.S. citizens? And ultimately, the argument is, yes, you get the rights of U.S. citizens, but you can be discriminated against. So that was sort of not a victory for him. But, the role of the citizen was, how do you determine it? And this goes to the 14th Amendment. So our first real discussion of the 14th Amendment is going to involve citizenship. The argument goes that you are a U.S. citizen if you are born in the land of the United States. So if you're born on American territory, even if your name is Wong Kim Ark, you are a U.S. citizen. That's the jus soli, the right of soil or dirt, or being born in America. And then if your mom or dad or both are American citizens, you're also a natural born citizen, jus sanguinis, so natural citizenship. But if you immigrate and have become a citizen through the naturalization process, you also are a citizen. So this debate about what and who a citizen was essential and really hadn't quite been laid to rest. That's why you may recall something called the insular cases that are going to be dealing with the Spanish-American War. Like, where does the Constitution protect and what rights are guaranteed? So that takes us to the election of 1880. Hayes will not be the nominee. The Republicans are debating amongst themselves over who will be the best spoilsman, who will be the best operative to secure, the spoils, the patronage that they want. And they're really, within the Republican Party, two political factions, and they're called the half-breeds, and these are not necessarily names that they adopt, but they're called half-breeds because they sort of adopted an idea of reform, civil service reform, sort of. But you have these sort of dedicated non-reformers called the stalwarts, or convicted Republicans, or definite Republicans. So you have James Blaine of Maine. His arguments, often his groups, are against the other Republicans, led by Roscoe Conkling. And so it looks like they're not going to come to some sort of agreement on whether or not a half-breed or a stalwart Republican, both of these are Republicans, are going to agree. So they come up with a compromise candidate, James A. Garfield. And then they put a stalwart candidate. Both sides agree that this guy's enough of a compromise. And then they put a stalwart in the vice presidency. So these are two different factions representatives. Both are Republicans, and part of the Republican machine. Now, the Dems have a really good opportunity to win here because they run a Union hero, General Hancock, who had been a nominee back in '84. And honestly, I think he's not 84 in 76, and also a nominee in 72. The Dems have been kicking his name around for a while. He was a hero of the Battle of Gettysburg, and no doubt that he was a U.S. hero. Plus, it's now 15 years after the Civil War. The bloody shirt's kind of fading, and it looks like they might be able to secure a victory if they can win enough northern states, because obviously they're going to win the South. They're Democrats. So here's a cartoon of the period showing all the various issues the Democratic Party has in its closet. Kind of think of it instead of the skeleton in the closet so much as a curio shop, and Hancock's trying to find a way to mediate all these different sections of the Democratic Party. And you have a truly sectional election. Look at this: Democrats, Republicans. So very, very close. Now the reason the electoral vote isn't is that if you consider which state fails, the Dems do not carry New York. If they had carried New York, then this would have been an inverted. It would have been President Hancock. So it was very close. And so in comes President Garfield, and he's like President Harrison, William Henry Harrison, just a person we don't remember much about for a reason, and that is he gets shot. He gets shot by an individual, a lunatic, really, who believes that somehow the death of President Garfield will lead to President Arthur selecting him for a job or some element of national service. This is obviously a flawed, dangerous individual, but the death of Garfield over public jobs is really going to bring the issue of reform full force. So one of the dominant issues of this period in history is how to end the spoils system. And so with the death of Garfield, Arthur was a spoilsman. I mean, he was very much a part of the Republican political machine, but he is going to accept, and I'm going to show you this, something passed by this Ohio senator. Now, before that, though, keep in mind, this is patronage. An old politician to a young politician in a satirical manner. Never let yourself lose the fact that it's politics that's our great game. And as a teacher of government, I see this still to this day. Basically, people do it like they're picking sides. Mr. Lincoln was not practical, particularly because of the way he viewed politics. All right. He held that ours is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. That's silly. We're a country of the government of the politicians. So here's a guy, and again, this is satirical, not like a literal letter. But the idea is that you must win over politics. Well, that's just corrupt. That's not right. And so out of that comes this very, very famous law, really one of the few laws that people remember from the Gilded Age, and that's the Pendleton Civil Service Act. Now, this act was created to take federal jobs and classify them as civil servant jobs, which meant no longer would they be appointed. These jobs would not be filled by presidential appointment. They would be filled by a competitive civil service exam. Now, you may recall that there were hundreds of thousands of Americans in the federal government, and only 14,000 were classified. But by the 20th century, half of all civil service jobs are classified. Today, they all are. Only about 3,000 Americans are selected to federal offices. So this is the slow but steady decline of the spoils system. And I'm going to stop with that for this lesson, and we'll continue on with the part 2 of it shortly. Thank you.